Chapter 5 Causes of the French and Indian War. French and Indian War had very complex origins. In part, it was a continuation of the ongoing struggle between the two European powers of Great Britain and France. Both of these European powers had land claims in North America. The land claims of France stretched from Quebec, Montreal, and Detroit in the north, all the way down to Mississippi River and New Orleans, and from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Even though France had claimed more land, Great Britain had far more colonists living in the New World. In the 1740s and 50s, British colonists began to move west and settle in the Appalachian Mountains and Ohio River Valley, land which was claimed by France. France responded to this by building fortifications in the region. Then the British countered by building makeshift forts of their own nearby. Skirmishes between these forts is what led to war. The French and Indian War was fought between the Canadian French and British over control of the land between the Allegheny and the Mississippi River. There are three phases of the French and Indian War. The first was a local affair, which was basically just skirmishes between British colonists and French forces. Native Americans joined the side of the French because they believed that the French were more accommodating to the local people than the British were. The colonists tried to organize themselves, and in 1754 they gathered in Albany, New York, to form an intercolonial government, but nothing was able to be agreed upon. The second phase of the war, British Prime Minister William Pitt took charge, and he forced many colonists to fight in the war, even though the colonists were extremely unhappy about this. In the final phase of the war, Pitt tried to work with colonial assemblies to support the British troops. This move was very successful, because in 1761 the French forces surrendered in Montreal, and a formal truce was agreed upon 2 years later. Consequences of the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1763, France surrendered most of its entire North American empire. It ceded all lands east of the Mississippi River and in Canada to Great Britain. It ceded all lands west of the Mississippi River to Spain. British colonists were extremely pleased with this because this made lands west of the Appalachians easier to settle. Now, one of the first post-war British acts was not a revenue act. The Proclamation Act of 1763 drew a line through the Appalachian Mountains. Great Britain ordered the colonists not to settle beyond the line because the government did not want to provoke more warfare with native peoples in the region. The land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River was designated for Native Americans only. Colonists were extremely unhappy about this because they had felt like they had sacrificed so much in the war that they deserved these newly claimed lands. Another result was that the next generation of leaders was trained. Many leaders in the local government were first forced to learn how to lead and unite their people in times of trouble. This would prove invaluable later during the American Revolution when these same men would have to lead their colonies against the British Empire. It also forced the colonists to consider independence, because at the beginning of the war they felt like they were alone without British help and they had to learn how to fend for themselves against the French enemy. It also ended salutary neglect, because the British government had to play a larger part in colonial affairs because it needed to collect money to pay off the large debt accumulated from fighting the war. Other wars. Queen Anne's War was the second in a series of 4 French and Indian Wars fought between the English and the French in North America. It's also known as the War of Spanish Succession in Europe, a result of struggle for superiority in the European and North American continents. The War of Jenkins' Year was a war between British and Spain forces lasting from 1739 to 1748. It centered mainly on disputes in land claims and shipping rights, and shipping on the seas suffered from piracy during these times. King George's War was the third in a series of Anglo and French conflicts in North America. The war was named after King George III, who was the English monarch during the time of the conflict, and was the North American extension of the War of Austrian Succession, which was taking place in Europe. The Cherokee War was located in the south between the Cherokee Native Americans, South Carolinians, and Virginians, and this had grown from just growing tensions between the two groups of people. Accumulation of debt. The 7 Years' War had a great effect on the war debt of Britain. As a result of the 7 Years' War, the debt went from 75 million to 145 million. In order to raise revenue to pay back this debt, Parliament put in place various taxes on everyday goods consumed by the colonists. These taxes were unrealistically high and therefore created a great amount of turmoil. The Sugar Act, also known as the Revenue Act, added items to the list of products that the colonists could only buy from Great Britain. This was effective in making sure that the colonists didn't buy cheaper goods from some other country. This way it guaranteed that Britain could raise lots of revenue. The Stamp Act was another act put in place after the 7 Years' War. This act put in place a tax on almost every paper good that was consumed by the colonies. This act infuriated the colonies, and caused a defiance of authority which can be seen in the Stamp Act riots. The Currency Act declared that no colony could issue paper money. This was harmful to the colonies because it restricted trade by keeping them from having currency to pay with. The townshend duties were a series of duties also put in place to raise revenue. The purpose of these acts were to raise money to pay the salary of governors and judges so they would be independent of the colonial rule and create more effective means of enforcing taxes. Finally, the Tea Act was an act that allowed Americans to buy cheap tea without import taxes or middlemen. However, the Americans refused to buy and drink this tea because it would be a representation of their acceptance of Parliament's authority. As a result, groups got together and decided not to buy or drink the tea at all. Protests against Act and Britain's response. As a result of the various unrealistic taxes put in place by Parliament, the colonists began to protest and show acts of defiance. These protests were among the first sightings of colonists coming together to revolt against the Crown. Stamp Act riots were a series of riots following the passage of the Stamp Act. There were various protests in the streets from regular colonists protesting the acts, as well as acts of resistance from colonial legislators. The Stamp Act Congress was the first significant colonial response to any British measure. Stamp Act Congress, they created 12 resolutions that said that Parliament had the right to legislate, but didn't have the right to directly tax without colonial representation, hence the saying, no taxation without representation. The Boston Massacre was an instance where colonial people were shouting insults at British soldiers, and due to a misunderstanding, one of the soldiers thought he was given the order to fire and ended up firing. Only 5 people were killed, but it had the potential to be a huge massacre. Boston Massacre also aligned Parliament as well as the colonies, and as a result, opposition died down for a little while. Although protests died down, many colonists were setting up committees of correspondence. These committees started in Boston. By the end of 1773, all but 3 colonies had them. These committees enumerated the rights of the colonies. The Boston Tea Party is possibly the most famous example of the colony's resistance to British authority. As an act of resistance to the Tea Act, members of the Massachusetts colony in Boston area dressed up as Native Americans and boarded British tea ships in the Boston port and dumped boxes of tea into the sea. This was considered as an act of destroying British property. As a result of the damage to British property done by the Boston Tea Party, Parliament enacted the Coercive Acts, most commonly known as the Intolerable Acts. This act closed the Boston port until all damages from the Boston Tea Party were repaid, and stripped the council of veto power. The beginnings of democracy. When acts began to strike the heart of the local government, colonists had begun to recognize the all-powerful British government trampling the rights of its subjects. The Continental Congress met for the first time in Philadelphia, began to transform a 10-year-old debate conducted by separate colonies to a unified American cause. Delegates from all over the colonies converged together. Discussions centered not on how to prepare for war, but rather on how to resolve sectional differences that most delegates feared were irreconcilable. After weeks of debate, the delegates agreed to a Declaration of Rights and Resolves, which attempted to define American grievances and justify colonists' defiance of English policies and law. By the time the Second Continental Congress met, government became badly torn in the colonies. This new idea of revolutionary republicanism began to take shape. Revolutionary republicanism was much favored during this period, and its main ideas were popular sovereignty, rule by law, and legislation of representatives. Resistance to authority. Struggle with England over colonial rights between 1763 and 1764 did not occur in a unified society. Social and economic changes brought deep unrest and called for many reforms. Those cities contained very little percentage of colonial population. They were the core of Republican agitation. As centers of communication, government, and commerce, they led the way in protesting English policy. Colonial women also played a vital role in the movement toward revolution. They drew upon revolutionary arguments to define their own goals. They signed non-importation agreements, harassed non-complying merchants, and helped organize fast days, on which communities prayed for deliverance from English oppression. However, their most important role was to facilitate the boycott of English goods. Farmers also played a role in rebellions, since a majority of settlers made their living in agricultural areas. Living far from the English customs officers, pressmen gangs, and occupying armies, the colonists of the interior were gradually drawn into the resistance movement by their urban leaders. In conclusion, looking back, we see that at the beginning of this time period, the colonists were rather separate from Great Britain, but then they were brought together through the French and Indian War. Then in the following Revenue Acts, the colonists became unhappy with Great Britain, and tensions rose as the colonies rebelled. And they would even rebel to the point of war, which comes up in the next couple of years. Now, looking to today, we see that our government is also involved in an extremely expensive and unpopular war. And while we may not be going to war with our government in the foreseeable future, we still need to look back upon these times so we can take the lessons that and commit them to today so we don't make the same mistakes that they made back then.